In the early decades of the 21st century, humanity slipped into what later historians would call the Second Dark Age. Not a single momentary lapse, but a grinding descent. Scientific institutions fell silent in places, maintenance schedules collapsed, and long-accumulated knowledge went unpracticed. Plagues returned with ferocious mutability, and storms and earthquakes moved in patterns no one had seen before. Cities that had once pulsed with electric life became islands of silence. Laboratories and observatories, their instruments rusting, recorded fewer breakthroughs and more warnings. By 2063, a single catastrophic season of crop failures swept across continents. Wheat blighted, oceans of plankton poisoned, rain patterns broken, and the storehouses that once could have buffered entire populations emptied in months. Governments, starved of tax revenue and legitimacy, cut social programs and cancelled modernization projects. Armies were furloughed, then disbanded. Professional soldiers became farmers or scavengers. Conscription systems collapsed as communities hoarded able bodies to keep hearth and home. Only one of the great Western powers, a state with the industrial remnants and political will to hold on to a modern arsenal, kept its war machine intact. In July of 2097, with precision and grim resolve, that power moved to seize what remained. It launched an invasion that swept across the globe. The victory was mechanical and devastating. Unmanned bunkers, once bristling with automated defenses, waited for orders that would never be given. Reactive systems failed. Supply chains had been severed. A few squads of starving soldiers stood against armored columns and orbital guided strikes and were simply erased. The conquerors claimed the planet, but what they inherited was an atmosphere grinding toward collapse. Pollution had accumulated for generations. Industrial runoff, airborne toxins, and the melting of polar ice had altered weather and currents. Whole ecosystems began to unspool. Disease returned with new vectors. Famine was not an emergency, but the normal calendar. Faced with extinction, survivors and elites reached the same cold conclusion. To save humanity, they would have to leave the cradle. The decision was ruthless and practical. Years of consolidation of wealth, labor, and technology followed. An enormous, morally stained concentration of resources that could build something capable of ferrying life away from a dying world. This was not the hopeful exodus of romance. It was an engineered evacuation born of desperation, an economic and ethical crucible that would set the tone for everything to come. They called it Ellipsis, a name that suggested continuation, a mission, an unfinished sentence pointing to the future. In orbit above a dying blue planet, engineers and the last functioning shipyards assembled a teardrop-shaped vessel of silvered alloys and layered shielding, designed to slip the bonds of time and carry life between stars. Ellipsis was not a simple ship. She was an ark, radiation-hardened, cryogenic capable, with drives that flirted with relativistic thresholds. Her hull bore the scars of hurried manufacture and the signatures of genius, welded by hands that had no time for pride. Selection for the Ark became an act of both science and cruelty. Embryos from what the planners judged the finest genetic lines were flash-frozen and catalogued. Small, precious populations of animals were kept alive, bred, and eventually placed in containment modules. The public rhetoric spoke of saving biodiversity and seed stocks. Behind closed doors, the project rationed food, fuel, and medicine in a calculus that decided who would work and who would be sacrificed to feed the effort. The consolidation of resources required food convoys and labor camps. Whole neighborhoods emptied so workshops could be fed. In the desperate calculus of survival, millions of the poor and displaced were considered expendable. Their removal, by starvation or displacement, ensured that the workers who remained could complete Ellipsis. Ethics committees, if they existed, were shadows. Protests by racial purists, religious sects, and imprisoned activists claimed both moral high ground and political leverage. But the momentum of the project and the fear of extinction drowned dissent. Ellipsis was completed under a pall of mourning and triumph. When her engines primed and her launch coils engaged, the remaining world watched a bright tear cut the sky and a silver sliver leave the cradle of humanity. Ellipsis fled into the void, carrying a cargo of futures. She traced a path between the stars toward a planet whose coordinates would be spoken about like the names of saints. Aerth, Eden, New Eden, sometimes simply New Earth. The transit took years, measured not in familiar seasons but in cycles of maintenance, power shifts, and the slow, mechanical nurture of growing children. The human seedlings aboard were not cradled by living parents. Instead, nurturing robots, precise, patient machines engineered to emulate human care, raised the infants. These caretakers monitored growth, soothed fevers, recited recorded stories, and structured education. The children that grew under their guidance were called the cryos. They lacked the messy improvisation of human upbringing, but gained a steady, methodical base of knowledge and health. The culture aboard Ellipsis was equal parts archive and nursery. The history of the old world, its triumphs and failures, maps of cities gone to ruin, the technologies that had once made life easier, and the policies that had helped end it, was recorded onto 120 high-density information storage units called HIDIS. Those drives were designed to be living textbooks. Contested histories were preserved alongside moral critiques. Engineering blueprints sat next to philosophical treatises. The intention was explicit. Let the children know what went wrong, so they would not repeat it. When Ellipsis finally decelerated and the cryos disembarked, they did so onto soil that was at once alien and familiar. The first generations were steeped in HIDIS knowledge, but the translation of facts into culture is never seamless. Lessons learned in a metal womb became contested narratives under a different sky. The ship's children bore two inheritances: the cold accuracy of recorded history and the messy human need to reinterpret, argue, and divide. The HIDIS units seeded more than facts. They transmitted narratives that clashed. Debates over what had caused Earth's collapse, industry, hubris, racial exploitation, or divine punishment, hardened into identity. Where once large, unified polities might have emerged, Aerth produced a collage of systems. Fascist warlords carving territories with brutal efficiency, inherited monarchies persisting in isolated valleys, experimental democracies rising and collapsing under the weight of factionalism. Governments formed and unformed like weather systems, and where rule was weak, militias, mercenaries, and bandit lords took root. Economics on Aerth pivoted toward primary production. Most people became farmers, miners, or herders, those who could coax yield from soil or extract value from the planet's strata. Aereth's surface yielded temptations. Native slabs of diamond and veins of unfamiliar alloys lay exposed in places, glittering like fortunes to those with pick and cart. Miners became a new landed class in some regions, and wherever valuable elements protruded, conflict followed. Some districts controlled lucrative mines with crude tolls and armed escorts. Others fell into the hands of adventurer bands who claimed land by force. Wildlife, a hybrid of earthborn species and Aereth's own fauna, evolved in unexpected directions. The animals that had been brought aboard Ellipsis were released when breeding succeeded, and the outcomes were messy. Wolves crossbred with native canids to produce larger, more cunning pack hunters. Cattle adapted to low-nutrient pastures, their hides developing camouflaged patterns to evade roving predators. In coastal marshes, introduced birds found niches among iridescent native fowl. The planet's foliage retained echoes of Earth's forests and plains, but often with color shifts, leaves in deep indigos, grasses tinged with bronze, making the landscape both familiar and subtly alien. Settlements tended to be small and resilient. Villages clustered along rivers and mineral-rich seams. A scattering of fortified towns dotted strategic passes. Large urban centers were rare, and usually the product of sustained control by an influential leader. For most inhabitants, life was labor, barter, and cautious travel. Adventurers existed in higher proportion than on the Lost Earth, but still formed a minority, driven people, mercenaries in search of pay, bounty hunters tracking deserters, gladiators risking life for coin, engineers seeking salvage, and snipers hired by anyone with coin and enemies. 3 centuries after the first wars that marked the planet's brutal infancy, Aerth skies gave the world an event no engineer or general could predict. Both moons slipped into an alignment and passed before the sun in a double eclipse. For observers across hemispheres, the daylight shifted into a hue like purple fire. Shadows thinned and colors bled into strange intensities. The phenomenon lasted hours, then days, and the after effects lingered for months. Eyes adjusted to altered wavelengths. Some people never regained their old sight perfectly. More startling were the reports of people doing things they had never done before. At first, the changes were small. A farmer stopping a blade in midair without touching it. A child making the water in a pail rise into a spiral. A soldier feeling the heat of a flame subside at a gesture. These incidents were catalogued in the Hydis-like records of new settlements, whispered about in taverns, and feared in halls of power. A minority of individuals discovered that they could manipulate elements, bend minds, or summon energies that defied mechanical explanation. They retreated, often instinctively, to study and control what had awakened in them. Over years, these secluded practitioners developed systems, schools, and languages around their talents. The existence of magic fractured societies further, but in a particularly cruel arithmetic. Those without power feared those with it. Witch hunters, bounty hunters specialized in tracking and exterminating the occult, arose as a grim industry. They were efficient, ruthless, and sometimes hired by regimes fearful of insurgent mages. In other places, governments sought to harness these new forces, embedding war magicians into military units, where a company might roster 1 or 2 of these specialists. A war magician could alter battlefield geometry, obscure troop movements with veil spells, or rain concentrated energies in support of artillery. Armies that integrated such magicians gained new tactical dimensions. Magic itself differentiated into schools as varied as the cultures that birthed them. Elementalists clustered where nature was raw and dramatic, at waterfall terraces where storms met cliffs, atop volcanic ridgelines where lava breathed, and along windswept capes where the air tasted of salt and ozone. Each elementalist bond focused intensely on a single natural force: air, water, fire, earth, or darkness. And their training became both ascetic and experimental. A fire elementalist would learn to shape flame into blades that seared and shielded, while a water practitioner might pull blood-warm tides to heal or drown. Darkness, an element treated with superstition, proved a fertile field for stealth and concealment spells, as well as more morally ambiguous arts. Sorcerers and warlocks followed less predictable paths. Where elementalists cultivated the raw patterns of nature, sorcerers plied a broader, more chaotic set of occult currents, drawing on symbols, sigils, and arcane resonance. Warlocks and arcane warriors often began under shared tutelage from older mentors, survivors who had stood witness to the eclipse. But rivalries and doctrinal splits produced divergent philosophies. One faction emphasized raw combat enhancement, magic that bolstered the warrior's limbs, clarified limbs' reaction times, and allowed arcane armed combat. Another embraced manipulation, subtle curses, binding rituals, and glamour works that could turn a fight before it began. Necromancers exploited death itself. In regions where war had left entire valleys haunted by bones and memory, these practitioners learned to raise corpses into disciplined ranks, to bind spirits to service, and to corrupt the living with plagues that served their ends. Their arts were abhorred, and yet they could be feared allies for a warlord with neither morals nor limits. Druids and monks, whose lineages had faded before the eclipse, re-emerged in enclaves. Some monks built monasteries that combined meditation with mnemonic rituals. Druids found living groves where the planet's subtle currents could be strung and read like harp strings. Fighting illusionists, martial artists whose techniques fused physical prowess with illusionary spells, blurred the line between physical and occult combat. A fighting illusionist could, in the blink of an eye, create phantasmal duplicates, break an opponent's commitment to a strike, or overlay a battlefield with deceptive terrain. The social consequences were vast. Merchants sought enchanted goods, aspect bands, rings and relics that altered attributes. Armorsmiths learned to embed runes into mail. Entire industries arose around resistance, charms, wards, and or resilience artifacts. At the same time, paranoia spread. Communities built wards around wells, caravans traveled with amulets, and secret orders traded in knowledge protection. Some leaders recruited mages aggressively, training them into military doctrine. Others outlawed magic and burned those discovered. The planet's conflicts shifted to include both ballistic arsenals and occult cataclysms, and the strategic maps of power were redrawn with sigils as much as borders. Against this tapestry, individuals still wrote their own tales. Paladins and knights of chaos clashed with ideals as much as swords. Gladiators still found fame and doom in arenas where crowd hunger met personal courage. Adventurers assembled kits of gear, weapons, and arcane scrolls, or they committed a handful of spells to memory and set out on quests that could change the fate of a village or a nation. The mixture was intoxicating. A sniper's long-range patience balanced against a war magician's disruptive barrage. A druid's communion with a grove could halt an industrial mining project. A necromancer's uprising could topple a petty kingdom. For those who would roleplay Aerth, the world is an engine for stories. Roleplay here is not mere chance or blind competition. It is collaborative storytelling where choices shape consequences. Characters are not scores on a page but personalities, flawed, ambitious, cowardly or brave, who must work together or fall apart. The game rewards thought, not only dice. When a party decides to parley with a warlord instead of attacking, they can change a campaign's entire arc. When a GM sets a scene, the purple-tinged sky after an eclipse, the smell of burnt oaks around a battlefield, a whispered legend about a lost Hydis, players are invited to inhabit those worlds with nuance. Practical play mirrors the world's complexity. Characters keep detailed sheets, attributes like strength and reflexes, combat scores, magic points, health, resilience, and the encumbrance of armor and gear. Dice introduce uncertainty. The roll can make a difference, but the decision and roleplay define the narrative. The games master, the GM, remains central. Narrator, referee, and co-conspirator, shaping weather, NPC motives, and the moral texture of encounters. Aerth's setting rewards imagination. Explore mines of native diamond, negotiate with an elementalist sect, infiltrate a witch hunter lodge, or defend a small farming hamlet from a band of mercenaries led by a warlock. So gather your weapons, tune your spells, and prepare your character sheet. On Aerth, martial technology clashes with the power of magic. Reputations are forged in amphitheaters of blood and in whispered councils of power. Every choice echoes. Every small victory reshapes alliances. This is a world born from the ashes of Earth, alive with danger and wonder. A place for stories that will be told long after the next eclipse paints the sky.